A corporate CEO threw a single mom out of his own office building in 1980. What he didn't know would cost him everything. She wasn't just another tenant. She was the owner, and what happened next changed his life forever. Margaret Sullivan stood in the marble lobby of the Richardson Tower on Fifth Avenue, her 6-year-old daughter clutching her hand. It was March 1980, and the building gleamed with that new money shine that defined the era. Margaret had come to discuss a late rent payment, just 3 days overdue, because her paycheck from the department store had been delayed. CEO Robert Patterson stormed through the lobby that Tuesday morning, his Armani suit cutting through the crowd of business people like a shark through water. He saw Margaret, noticed her worn coat, saw her daughter, and made an assumption that would destroy him. He didn't ask questions. He didn't listen. He just acted. Margaret tried to explain about the paycheck, about the delay, about how she'd have the money by Friday. Patterson cut her off mid-sentence. His voice echoed through that lobby loud enough for everyone to hear. He called security. 2 guards approached. Margaret's daughter started crying. The CEO kicked out a single mom right there in front of dozens of witnesses, telling her she had 24 hours to clear out her office space on the 3rd floor or he'd have her belongings thrown into the street. What Patterson didn't know was that Margaret Sullivan wasn't just a tenant. 3 years earlier, in 1977, her late husband, Thomas Sullivan, had purchased the Richardson Tower through a complex trust arrangement. When Thomas died in a car accident in 1979, everything transferred to Margaret. The building, the trust, the holdings, all of it. She owned the Richardson Tower. She owned the ground Patterson walked on. She owned his office. She owned everything. Patterson had been hired as CEO by the building's management company just 8 months earlier. Nobody told him about the ownership structure. Nobody explained the trust. Nobody mentioned that the quiet woman in the worn coat who rented a small office on the 3rd floor was actually his boss. The management company kept things compartmentalized, and Patterson never bothered to check the ownership documents. He just assumed he was running the show. Margaret walked out of that lobby with her daughter, humiliated but not defeated. She made 3 phone calls that afternoon. First to her late husband's attorney, David Chen. Second to the management company. Third to her brother-in-law, who worked in commercial real estate. By 5 o'clock that evening, the pieces were in motion. The next morning, Wednesday, Patterson arrived at his office to find David Chen waiting for him. The attorney handed him a folder. Inside were ownership documents, trust papers, and a termination letter. Patterson's face went white. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. The CEO kicked out a single mom, and now that single mom was kicking him out. Chen explained everything in that cold, precise lawyer voice. Margaret owned the building. Patterson was fired effective immediately. His severance would be minimal because his contract included a conduct clause, and publicly humiliating the building's owner in the lobby definitely qualified as a violation. Patterson had 30 minutes to clear his desk, but Margaret wasn't finished. She'd spent that Tuesday night remembering every slight, every dismissive comment, every time Patterson had treated service workers and lower-level employees like they were invisible. She'd heard the stories from other tenants. The CEO kicked out a single mom, but he'd been cruel to countless others before her. Margaret made more calls. She reached out to every tenant in the building, all 47 of them. She cut their rent by 15% across the board for the next 6 months. She fired the management company that had hired Patterson and brought in a new team, one that actually cared about people. She converted Patterson's massive corner office into a childcare center for working parents in the building. She didn't do it for revenge. She did it because it was right. The story spread through New York's business community like wildfire. By Friday, every major newspaper had picked it up. The CEO kicked out a single mom who owned the building became the cautionary tale of 1980. Patterson's career never recovered. Nobody wanted to hire a CEO who couldn't even figure out who owned the building he was running. Margaret used the media attention to launch something bigger. She started a foundation helping single mothers get access to business loans and commercial real estate. She knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be dismissed, to be treated like you didn't matter. She turned that pain into purpose. Here's what most people don't know about this story. Patterson's assumption wasn't random. He'd been kicking people out of that building for months, always targeting those he considered beneath him. A cleaning woman who asked for a raise, an elderly tenant who needed extra time to pay, a young black man who'd started a graphic design business on the second floor. Patterson had created a culture of fear in the Richardson Tower, and everyone felt it. When Margaret took control, she personally called each person Patterson had mistreated. She offered the cleaning woman that raise and a promotion to head of facilities. She gave the elderly tenant a rent-free month and a new lease. She invested in the young designer's business and gave him a larger space. The CEO kicked out a single mom, but that single mom built a community. The childcare center opened in June 1980. Margaret hired 3 full-time staff members and kept the rates affordable. Working mothers in the building finally had a safe place for their kids during business hours. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Patterson's office, the symbol of his power and cruelty, had become a place of care and support. Patterson tried to fight back. He hired lawyers, claimed wrongful termination, argued that the ownership documents were unclear. Every case got thrown out. The evidence was overwhelming. He'd violated his contract. He'd abused his authority. He'd publicly humiliated the building's owner. No judge in New York was going to side with him. By September 1980, Patterson was working as a middle manager at a small firm in New Jersey, making a fraction of his former salary. His reputation was destroyed. His network abandoned him. The CEO kicked out a single mom, and the business world kicked him out in return. Margaret's daughter, little Sarah Sullivan, grew up in that building. She watched her mother turn pain into power, humiliation into help, cruelty into kindness. Years later, Sarah would say that watching Patterson get escorted out by security taught her the most important lesson of her life. Never underestimate anyone, never judge by appearance, never assume you know someone's story. The Richardson Tower became one of the most sought-after business addresses in Manhattan. Margaret's reputation for fairness and compassion attracted quality tenants. The building stayed full, rents stayed stable, and the community thrived. She proved that you could run a successful business while treating people with dignity. What would you have done in Margaret's position? Would you have shown mercy or made sure justice was served? Drop your answer in the comments. Patterson's story should have ended there, but there's more. In 1983, 3 years after the incident, he showed up at the Richardson Tower again. He was broke, unemployed, and desperate. He asked to speak with Margaret. Her assistant tried to turn him away, but Margaret agreed to meet him. They sat in her office, the same office where she used to work before taking over the building. Patterson apologized. He explained that losing everything had forced him to confront who he'd become. The CEO kicked out a single mom, but in doing so, he'd kicked himself out of the life he'd built on cruelty and assumption. Margaret listened. She didn't forgive him immediately. She asked him questions. What had he learned? How had he changed? What would he do differently? Patterson answered honestly. He'd been volunteering at a homeless shelter. He'd been attending therapy. He'd been trying to understand why he'd treated people so badly. Margaret made him an offer, not a job, not money, but a chance. She knew a small property management company looking for someone with experience. They worked with affordable housing, nothing glamorous, nothing high-powered. Patterson would be starting from the bottom again. She'd put in a word for him, but only if he proved himself first. She wanted him to volunteer at the childcare center for 3 months. No pay, just showing up and helping. Patterson agreed. For 3 months, the former CEO cleaned toys, read stories to kids, and helped working parents. He saw Margaret every day, watched how she ran the building, learned what leadership actually meant. The CEO kicked out a single mom, and that single mom taught him how to be human again. The property management company hired him in early 1984. He stayed there for the rest of his career, never rising above middle management, never chasing power again. He'd learned his lesson in the hardest way possible. Margaret continued running the Richardson Tower until 1995, when she sold it for a substantial profit. She used the money to expand her foundation, helping thousands of single mothers access business opportunities. The CEO kicked out a single mom, and that moment of cruelty became the spark for decades of positive change. Sarah Sullivan, Margaret's daughter, eventually took over the foundation. She expanded it nationally, creating programs in 30 states. She always kept a photo in her office from March 1980, showing her mother standing in the Richardson Tower lobby, the same spot where Patterson humiliated her. The photo reminded Sarah that your lowest moment doesn't define you. How you respond does. The business lessons from this story are clear. Never judge people by appearance. Never assume you understand someone's position. Never treat anyone as less than human, because you never know who you're actually dealing with. The CEO kicked out a single mom, but his real mistake was thinking he had the power to do so without consequences. Patterson died in 2003. His obituary mentioned his early career success, but focused more on his later work with affordable housing and his volunteer efforts. Some people get second chances, some people actually change. But the first impression, that moment of cruelty in 1980, that's what most people remembered. Margaret died in 2010, surrounded by family and friends. Her obituary filled half a page in the New York Times. Hundreds of people attended her funeral, including dozens of single mothers whose lives she'd changed. The CEO kicked out a single mom, but that single mom changed the world. The Richardson Tower still stands on Fifth Avenue. It's been renovated and modernized, but the childcare center remains. New owners kept it running as a tribute to Margaret. A plaque in the lobby tells the story, reminding everyone who enters about the day in March 1980, when assumptions met reality and lost. Think about your own life. Have you ever underestimated someone? Have you ever been underestimated? Share your story in the comments, because these experiences shape us all. This story isn't just about revenge or justice, it's about the assumptions we make every single day. Patterson looked at Margaret and saw a struggling single mom who couldn't pay rent on time. He didn't see a widow still grieving her husband. He didn't see a business owner managing a complex trust. He didn't see a human being deserving of respect. He saw what he expected to see, and it destroyed him. The 1980s were a different time. Corporate culture was cutthroat. Greed was celebrated. Power meant everything. Patterson was a product of that culture, but he took it too far. The CEO kicked out a single mom in an era when such behavior was common, but even then, people recognized it as wrong. Margaret's response was perfect because it wasn't just about punishment. She fixed the culture Patterson had created. She helped the people he'd hurt. She built something lasting. Revenge would have felt good for a day. Building a better community felt good for decades. The employees at the Richardson Tower in 1980 never forgot what happened. When Margaret took over, morale improved overnight. People worked harder because they felt valued. Tenant turnover dropped to almost zero. The building became profitable not because of aggressive management, but because of human decency. The CEO kicked out a single mom, and in doing so, he proved that cruelty is bad business. Modern leadership experts study Margaret's approach. She demonstrated that compassion and profit aren't opposites. She showed that treating people well creates loyalty, stability, and success. The CEO kicked out a single mom, but that single mom wrote the playbook for ethical leadership. Patterson's fall should have been predictable. He'd made enemies throughout his career. He'd burned bridges. He'd prioritized short-term power over long-term relationships. When he needed help after his termination, nobody answered his calls. He'd spent years proving that he didn't value people, so people didn't value him. The trust that owned the Richardson Tower was designed by Thomas Sullivan to protect his family. He'd built a successful import business in the 1970s and invested in real estate. When he died unexpectedly, the trust ensured Margaret and Sarah would be financially secure. Thomas never imagined his widow would face someone like Patterson, but he'd given her the tools to fight back. Margaret often said that March Day in 1980 was both the worst and best day of her life after Thomas died. Worst because of the humiliation and fear. Best because it forced her to step into power she didn't know she had. The CEO kicked out a single mom, and that single mom discovered she was stronger than she ever imagined. What's the most important lesson here? That wealth and power can hide in unexpected places, that cruelty always backfires, that assumptions are dangerous. Maybe it's all of these things. Maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's just that every person you meet deserves basic respect, regardless of what you think you know about them. The story of Margaret Sullivan and Robert Patterson became a legend in New York business circles. People told it at networking events, used it in training seminars, referenced it in books about management. The CEO kicked out a single mom became shorthand for catastrophic failure caused by arrogance and assumption. If you found this story valuable, if it made you think differently about how you treat people, let me know in the comments. Real change starts with awareness.